Good evening. I'm Susan Neiman, Director of the Einstein Forum, and I'm happy to welcome you to the virtual Einstein Forum. We are pleased to host tonight Professor Evandro Agazzi, who's coming to us from a town near Genoa. Chairing the session is our this year's Einstein Fellow, Sham Wupaluri, who has brought us Professor Agazzi and several other distinguished guests. Thank you, Sham. You're on.
Thank you, Susan. Today is 11th of November, 2021. It's a great honor to have Professor Evandro Agazzi with us tonight. He is widely renowned in academia and he needs no introduction, but for those of you tuning in just now, I will do the needful. Evandro Agazzi is currently full professor in Department of Bioethics of Pan American University of Mexico City and emeritus professor of Universities of Freiburg and Geneva. He was president and now honorary president of International Academy of Philosophy of Science, of International Federation of Philosophical Societies, and of the International Institute of Philosophy in Paris. He has received several honorary doctorates from European and American universities and has published in several languages, more than 90 books and 1,000 papers in various books and journals as an author and an editor in the domains of logic, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of physics, general philosophy of science, metaphysics, ethics of science and technology, bioethics, and education. He is the editor of the international journals Epistemologia and Bioethics Update. Today, he will be speaking on the defense of scientific realism. Professor Agazzi, here, the floor is here.
Thank you very much for your kind presentation and for your kind invitation. I liked very much this invitation because I have a special link with Germany. I was visiting professor in Düsseldorf. I spent a stay of research in logic and foundational mathematics in Münster, in Marburg. So I have special links with German philosophy and German culture in general. So I had imagined that this was a good opportunity of coming personally to the Einstein house. But you know, what one decides doesn't depend on one's will. And so the pandemic has obliged us to find out different ways of communication. And we are just speaking about these new tools which are now available thanks to the digital technology. And so this digital technology make it possible to us and to many other people to join, listen, and also discuss, so not always in present. Okay, next point which deserves being a little clarified in advance is the idea of a defense. Why shall we provide a defense of something? Of course, because this means that there is a certain crisis in what we are going to defend. And what are we going to defend? A person? No. An author? No. What? Realism. Oh, realism. Scientific realism. So it is especially this idea of joining scientific, which is an adjective, with realism, which is a substantive, which requires certain clarification. What is this clarification? Okay, let's start with an elementary reflection. It's the following, that until practically the beginning of the past century, there was in the European culture in general, and even at the level of common sense, the spontaneous belief and conviction that science, when was investigating what? The world, the so-called external world, was knowing what? Reality. Realism means precisely this, that there is a reality about which we are thinking, about which we are speaking. And in particular, it was considered absolutely obvious that this was the case of science, of natural science in particular, because natural science is spontaneously understood as an investigation which concerns the external world. And this investigation is true. Ah, yes, it's true. What you are presenting in the discourse, and especially in particular in the scientific discourse, is true. Up to the point that for many persons, it was more or less implicit that the early discourse, which you can reliably believe to be true, is the scientific discourse. So the social prestige of science is something undeniable, but undeniable until what? Until precisely the end of the 19th century. With the beginning of the past century, of the 20th century, this idea doesn't receive a full acceptance, not by common sense, but by philosophers of science in particular, but gradually also by scientists. And so what happens? So, are you really sure that when you pronounce a scientific sentence in which you say something about, be careful, an unobservable entity, this entity really exists, really exists. At this moment we start making a certain difference between what you think, what you speak about, and what really exists. So here you see the root of realism. But one say, what can we know if we do not know reality? This is the big problem, and I don't tackle this problem, at least now. But what is important is the following. The attitude of the common sense and also of the scientists, practically from the origin of modern natural science, that is, the time of Galileo, beginning more or less of the 17th century, up to the end of the 19th century, was that science actually was able to attain true sentences, that the scientific knowledge was a true knowledge. Of course, already at the time of Galileo, there was a certain discrimination. But look, and the discrimination was precisely opposite to the one we find nowadays. Because Galileo, the famous passage of the Assayer says, when I consider any physical substance, any physical body, I can imagine this substance as having certain colors, smells, and so on. But these disappear once you remove the animal who is perceiving them, whereas the fact that this is one or more, that has such and such figure. Practically speaking, all the mathematizable properties, I cannot avoid applying these properties to whatever physical entity. And these are the only entities about which we can have a certainty, a strong knowledge, which in the discourse of Galileo was comparable with the divine knowledge. So you see, the observable are sensory perception, not only the sense of sight, but not the observable properties were believed to the properties about which we can attain truth and certainty. So this in a sense strange, but only to a certain extent it is strange, because what we had in the meanwhile, we had positivism, and positivism was opening the way to a very different point of view. Because in the positivistic perspective, not precisely in the perspective of the founder of positivism, that is the French philosopher Auguste Comte, but later, especially and particularly with Ernst Mach, was linked to a radical empiricism. According to Mach, the only knowledge is the sensory perceptions. Outside this, we may have some generalization. We can take into consideration regularities in the appearance of certain perception. And in such a way, what do we make? We construct theories. And theories has this characteristic. Theories introduce in the scientific discourse unobservable entities, which we use in order to understand and to explain the observable entities within a certain experimental setup. You see, the total revolution, because at this moment, one says, okay. But now, consider the actual status of scientific investigation. And so you have a certain set, let's say, of data or data. You can consider them as perception. You look into a microscope, you look in whatever instrument, telescope, you have certain perception. You see something. But in order to explain how and why these perceptions are there, you introduce hypotheses. You introduce, for example, the idea that what you have observed is the trace left by an elementary particle, by an electron. But did you see the electron? No. We didn't see the electron. But if we accept that there is an elementary particle, that there is electrons or other particles, and we can causally attribute to this elementary particle, the fact that we have observed something in a photographic place, we have explained. So the introduction of the non-observable is seen as what? It's a mental construction. And in fact, you may have conflicting theoretical explanations of the very same physical evidence. This is true because, of course, you must look and look and look to find out the so-called crucial experiment. Sometimes very, 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 very seldom, you may find one which can discriminate between two, let's say, two opposite theories. Let's take, for example, the wave theory of light and the corpuscular theory of light. At the beginning of the 19th century, there was, so to speak, some kind of an elementary experimenter who decided in favor of the wave interpretation of light. But this were only two. You may introduce perhaps additional theories that are able to explain the same data. And so you should find out another critical experiment in order to make a choice between the one and the other. But when do you really attain the true theory? Answer, never. And so why do you? Well, it's here the answer given by Mach. Well, this is just an economic value. When we speak of economics today, we think of money, not in the sense of money. Deconstruction of a certain theory allows us to economize thoughts, to economize mental activities. So we can put together, to join, to classify, to relate a great lot of sensory perception thanks to a certain theoretical construction. And when, so it is not, it's neither the goal, not the task of science to offer more than this. And you see here the introduction of the conventionalism and of the instrumentalist view of science. Conventionalism doesn't mean something incorrect. No. Conventions are not arbitrary decisions. Conventions are proposed as useful tools in order to attain a certain goal. So if you take this measure in general, you can solve more easily this task. If in the case of science, your task is that of understanding what appears in the experimental setup, you construct a theory. And thanks to this theory, you can have an image, a picture of the phenomenon that you are unable to observe. So, but are you obliged to admit that this really exists? This is the point. And in order to point out how important this position was, I must simply mention the fact that Ernst Mach lived long enough to see the development of the microphysics. And in spite of this, he never believed that molecules and atoms really exist. Nowadays, this seems to us so strange, almost silly. No. According to this philosophical perspective, well, we speak of molecules, we speak of atoms, the space of electrons, elementary particles. It was not even the moment of speaking about that, but we can speak about, but they are just fictitious entities that do not have a real correspondence. So here you find the root of anti-realism. Anti-realism concerns in a particular way the ontological status of unobservable entities introduced by theories. Of course, there are many forms of realism and anti-realism. I have published a book with Springer, whose title was Varieties of Scientific Realism. So there are varieties of scientific realism and also varieties of scientific anti-realism. But I don't want to go to explore this variety. It is simply interesting for us to take note of this transition from a position when we could call the position of classical science. When I speak of classical, I don't refer to the ancient Greek, which is the usual reference of the concept of classical. When you speak of classical philosophy, you speak of Greek, sometimes also Latin philosophy. When you speak of classical physics, in the jargon, in the language of philosophy of science, we refer to the physics from, let's say, Newton to Planck and to Einstein, just to put two names. So this was classical. Why classical? Because it was based on this obvious, for them, obvious belief that when you make scientific investigation on the external world, you know reality. But now what you can say if you don't say that science knows reality? And here it's complicated, the story, because there is a lot of confusion about that. You can say, okay, we construct some representations of reality. And we are never certain about the fact that these representations are true or false. And since we are never certain, we accept them on a practical basis. Well, here lies an important equivocation, the confusion between truth and certainty. Certainty is not something which is intrinsic to a proposition, intrinsic to a statement. Is something which concerns our psychological or mental status. So many times it's happened that people, normal people, but even scientists, had a certainty about something which was actually not true. But also the opposite is the case. many times we say, this is true, but I'm not certain. So you see, certainty concerns the transition from ignorance to doubt, and finally, little by little, you hope to attain certainty. So the ideal status would be that in which you have truth and certainty. Oh, this is paradise. To have truth and certainty. But only God probably has such a happy position. So the famous Popperian fallibilism relies on this confusion. What Popper says about falsificationism is in part not completely correct, but I don't enter into technicalities. But even taken prima facie is plausible. So it does concern certainty. Of course, Popper is right when one says we never have certainty because you have encountered many verifications. You see how many confusion. Verification means that you find truth. Veri is truth. Veritas is truth. No, if you could check and repeat, and you had several positive answers, nevertheless, there is still the possibility of a rational doubt. So the maximum you can attain is, this is certain beyond any, be careful, reasonable doubt. When a doubt is reasonable, this is mysterious. Because you can always doubt. Whatever is not what? Immediately evident. And here you see the importance of understanding the concepts. Because when you speak of evidence, especially in English, you mean what empirically is what? Evident. No. You cannot repeat evident. What is empirically ascertained? Okay. But this is typical of English. But in a more refined, classical, but in the sense of the tradition of philosophy, evidence is what is true in itself, for itself. So evidence has to do with truth. And in many cases, the evidence is not the starting point. Evidence is at the end of a very careful and difficult analysis and investigation. So evidence is what you little by little gain as the result of possible efforts in your investigation, and even after trying to see whether this was false. So you see the mixture, because there is obviously an interplay between truth, knowledge, doubt, and evidence. But by no way this is according to the most common ways of using the concept, because, as I repeat here, these concepts are by no way univocally determined. This is very important, because one cannot say truth is this, evidence is this, existence is this. One must specify in my discourse, in what I'm saying, I understand as evidence this. I understand as truth this. Once you have clarified the meaning of your concept, you can start discussing. To use an Aristotelian terminology, one could say you must first share the semantic logos. This means to agree on the sense, on the meaning. If you give the same meaning to all the terms and concepts, you can start discussion and disagree. But the fact of agreeing or disagreeing on what Aristotle says, the apophantic logos, correctly, you must first agree on the semantic logos. Once you have the same understanding of the concepts, you can start correctly being in agreement or disagreement, and you can provide proofs, arguments in favor or against the different position in your discussion. Oh, here we start having a little more light on the problem. Why? Because first of all, it makes no full sense to say that a certain sentence, that a certain proposition is true or false without making clear about what it is true or false. Truth is not a property which is intrinsic to a certain proposition, so to speak, as such. It depends on a particular relations between the meaning of the propositions and the referent, that is to say, and the object about which the proposition is being proposed. So in this case, you see that every science regards not the totality as such, but only special, particular, specific aspects of reality. And only about these aspects, the proposition of that science are expected to be true. Outside this domain, they are usually neither true nor false. They are not pertinent. In certain cases, there is a common superpositions. And this means the ontology of the different sciences. Now, the last word of my discourse, how can you attain this reference? Not by speaking, not by thinking. You must operate. If you can use, manipulate these entities, these abstract entities, they must exist. And you see, every science has its own operation for experiments, for verification, for falsification. And in this way, you can determine the specific ontology of the different scientific disciplines. I have the impression that my time is over. And I could go on speaking, but perhaps it is better that I try to listen to some questions and try to answer them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Agazzi, for your wonderful talk. And I would like to announce that the Q&A feature in the Zoom is on. And if some of those, including the panelists and the audience, wants to ask any question, just type it in and we would ask Professor Agazzi. So in the meanwhile, before we collect the questions, if I may begin to ask in the context of Einstein Forum, relating after all to Einstein, and in this context to Bohr and their debates concerning the nature of reality, if they were to travel into the present moment, how would the nature of the discussion change in the light of your talk and philosophy? And could you summarize their updated stance, if you can?
Well, I can try to summarize it. It's a very complex question because in order to understand the deep reason, you must go back to the Cartesian doubt. And the Cartesian doubt was itself grounded on a very, very, very strange presupposition. It's the following. Modern philosophy begins with this strange imagination. When we know, you know our representations, not reality. And immediately you have the problem. How can you be sure that your representations correspond to reality? This is the origin of the disaster, because there is no evidence, no argument in favor of this strange idea that I don't know a bottle in front of me. No, I know the representation of the bottle. And now, but is there really a bottle in front of me? Or perhaps, maybe there is a bottle, but it is not the bottle such as I see it. And the Cartesian doubt starts with this. And so you have the different solutions. There are those who say, well, what you can know are early ideas. They call ideas the representation. They were called idealist. Opposite. No. Thanks to the representation, thanks to very, very complicated discourses, you can know reality. Idealism and realism, they are already there. They are already there. And when you look at Kant, you have the tremendous effort to combine both and to have at the same time the rights of the realistic perspective, which was in the empiricist tradition, and the rights of the idealistic perspective, which was within the other position. And so you have the transcendental philosophy. But I believe that it would be too much complicated to speak about that. Now, let's come to the present debate, and you can see that in the case of Bohr and Heisenberg, they were about to speak. They were speaking about representations. This is the fact. And in spite of the name of relativity theory, the effort of Einstein is exactly the opposite. The relativity theory is the most profound effort of the absoluteness. Say, instead of speaking of absoluteness, you can speak of invariance, covariance. These are mathematical terminologies, but these terminologies make allusion to this effort to grasp reality in its possible, accessible mathematical formulations. I don't know whether I gave a certain answer to your question.
Surely you did. And we will have some more questions coming in. And in the meanwhile, I would also, in the spirit of your talk, want to ask about Nietzsche. You know, Nietzsche had coined this term or started this whole idea of perspectivism, which is related to the nature of subjectivity and later got intertwined with the notion of anti-realism. Could you say a few words how to reconcile and tame the notion of perspectivism so that it won't fall into the pit of anti-realism?
Well, I can accept this because I am a perspectivist. Because I have repeated many times that every science is characterized by a certain point of view on reality. But what does it mean, point of view? Means that within reality, you have a variety of properties, which I call attributes. And whatever science does not concern reality in general, but only certain attributes. So the perspective concerns the aspects of reality which you want really investigate within this science. And of course, there is also the counterpart of the subject. So the subject opened the investigation regarding this aspect. When you change perspective, you change also the reference of the subject. And I can give a very elementary image, which I often use. Imagine that you are in a tower and you have the sun, you have a room with 4 windows looking north, south, east, and west. So you look from one and you see a certain landscape. This is true. This is objective. This is the referent of your perspective. Then you go to the other windows. You see a very, very different. Of course, it's very different. The perspective has changed, but has changed both in the sense that you have seen from the other windows, and that you have considered a different aspect of the panorama. This is an elementary example which explains in which sense you can be, like I am, a perspectivist and at the same time a scientific realist.
Thank you. And I would also, in the context of the previous question and what you have answered in the terms of the metaphor of the tower that you gave, I would also like to ask about the pluralistic ontologies, and there is a corresponding issue related to that. If we take an entity, say an apple, it can be studied as a biological entity. You know, you can study it as a point-like particle in the Newtonian framework, or a collections of elementary particles and study it using quantum mechanics, or a geographical or an economic entity. Given these multitudes of perspectives, is it possible to coherently group them into a unity without resorting either to reductionism or forever abandoning the hope with the belief that such a unification of various perspectives is in principle unachievable?
Well, in this case, I must rely upon a topic which I have studied and developed at length in my own investigation. This is the systemic point of view and the theory of complexity. I have published articles and books on this problem. So what you are mentioning is very, very clear. Reality as such consists of different systems. And what is a system? A system is a unity of subsystems that are characterized by a specific structure and a specific function. But the properties of the system are different from the properties of whatever subsystem, in spite of resulting from the cooperation, the correlation of all the subsystems. So you see the big difference between the idea of system and the idea of set. In the case of set theory, you have elements belonging to a set. So elements have no distinguishing property. In the case of system, you have specificity of structure and properties of every subsystem. And whatever comes out is emergent. This is contained in what you mentioned in my paper on reductionism as antithetic to the scientific spirit. in an old paper of mine, scientific spirit is precisely the recognition of these diversities, which doesn't exclude the cooperation in a better, more complex unit. And so here, in this case, you can explain the idea of emergency, which is so badly treated very often, because emergency seems as something very mysterious. No, emergency is simply the fact that complexity implies that the superior unity has different properties in comparison with the inferior, but inferior not hierarchically. If I say that the heart and the lungs are different, they are different, but the organism cannot survive if the heart is out of service or the lungs are out of service. And the properties are properties not. Life is not the property of the brain, not the property of the heart, not the property of the lung. The life is the property of the organism. It is the organism who dies, in spite of the fact that sometimes one speaks of the cerebral death. But this is just a way of speaking.
Thank you. And I have one last question before I start taking questions from the audience. And if some of you have some questions, please type into Q&A and I would read it out to Professor Agazzi. My last question is, in layman's perspective, various disciplines of science, both internally and externally with regards to, say, humanities, seem disconnected. But various thinkers like yourself emphasized on the harmonious coexistence of sciences and technologies with social systems, including morals and ethics. And you yourself have contributed a lot to anthropology, bioethics, and so on. Under such a premise, my question is, do the stances that we take towards the method of science, be it realism, antirealism, and so on and so forth, do they have direct impact on the way we look at the areas of inquiry, such as humanity and ethics and so on? Do they have any correlation, the stance that we take towards the foundations of sciences? Do they have a direct or a very strange or an immediate reaction towards the inquiry that we have in ethics and humanities and so on?
Well, it is a rather complicated question, but I shall try to give a couple of answers which could make some contribution. One must be conscious that in science and technology, there is no space for the ought to be. Whereas ethics is typically centered on the idea of what ought to be. There is no difference much significance in this. So you can use investigation on the foundation of science, of biology, of physics, of sociology, or so. You can find lots of good, useful information of how things are. No information about how things ought to be, should be, no. How things should be depends on the values that you accept. And so when you speak of ethics, of something like bioethics, or different kinds of ethical investigation, you refer to ought to be, call it duty in general. So there is no duty in nature. And there is no possibility of reproaching. You cannot say, look, how bad this lion who is killing even an explorer. This is normal. There is no ought to be for a lion. No, there is no duty to respect whatever kind of living existing organism, be it a cow or an explorer. And so if you have clear this distinction of domain, this does not mean that in the domain of ethics, you have no disputes. You have many, many disputes which are comparable. This is important, comparable with the dispute in science. This is extremely interesting because I don't say you in such a way, you say that bioethics is a science. No, it's a domain in which there are many issues, problems, which depend on free choices. This is important. There are no free choices in science. There are no free choices in technology. So if you distinguish this domain, I believe that there is the possibility of having progress in the discussions. Of course, you need a spirit of dialogue and tolerance.
Thank you. And now we have some questions from the audience, starting with our Misha Gabovich. He would like to ask, would you agree that to some extent the kind of realism that you're advocating is pragmatist? After all, what matters, as you said, are the ways in which the objects of scientific inquiry can be practically manipulated. A pragmatist in the tradition of Dewey would also reject the Cartesian tradition on the grounds that the very senses that we use to observe the environment evolve in interaction with the environment. So distinguishing between our representation and the reality out there makes no sense. Is this an account you would agree with? And if not, how is your philosophical realism different from the pragmatic approach?
Well, I accept both good reasons of pragmatic attitude. So not in the extreme sense of a certain kind of pragmatism according to which there is no cognitive, strictly cognitive aspect in truth. So it is not correct to say that truth is something you can pragmatically show. But in spite of this, it is true that the fact of operating, and you know that operation are of paramount importance in my philosophy of science. My scientific realism is founded on the fact that you must use standardized operations in order to reach intersubjective agreement and in order to select within a certain thing what are the objects of your investigation. So in this sense, I agree that the fact of using, of making use, but making use doesn't mean to speak about. This is important. If you say, okay, I'm not sure that electrons exist, but if you can use electrons to make whatever you want, this means that you can use nothing. No, it must be something. If they are something, they are necessarily something real, not just a mental construction. In this sense, the pragmatic value of science and the paramount importance of technology, one of the best supports of scientific realism is precisely technology. Technology is the application of scientific knowledge. And technology confers scientific knowledge in this sense.
Thank you. We have one more question from Ritz. To what end would we want to know true reality if we ever are privy to it?
Please, can you repeat, because I didn't grasp everything correctly.
there's a question from Ritz, who would like to ask, to what end would we want to know through reality if we ever are privy to it?
Well, but this has to do with the orientation of life. Now, the orientation of life requires to determine our position in reality. And so if we don't rely upon a certain cognition and a certain idea of what is reality and what is the human individual, you cannot make any orientation of our life. So we need not to have a map, but we need to have a compass. A compass indicates an orientation of our life in the direction of what gives sense, gives meaning to our existence. And so this may be captured in different directions depending on different personal structure. There are people who find this full sense of life in the service of our persons. There are other people who find the sense of their life in the investigation of nature. And there are persons who consider that the sense of life ultimately relies on a religious devotion to God. There are many, many options in this sense.
Thank you. We have one more question from Marco Litterio. What kind of realism comes from Heisenberg's indetermination principle and the mental experiment of Schrodinger's cat?
Well, in the case of Heisenberg, of course, Heisenberg himself, in a little book he published about philosophical question of physics, expresses an opinion which I consider not correct when he says that what is really meant as an object of the physical investigation are the equations, to put it roughly. Now, this corresponds also to what had already expressed Heinrich Hertz in the preceding century. What is the electromagnetic field? Yes, the electromagnetic field are Maxwell equations. This was categorically wrong. Maxwell equations are mathematics, and the electromagnetic field is something physical. And in order to determine something about the electromagnetic field, you cannot make calculations. You must make a test, discover the waves. So in the case of the principle, Heisenberg principle, one must be conscious of the meaning. Uncertainty relation simply means that you have only a probabilistic space in which you can determine, for example, the position of an elementary particle. And this is compatible with the fact that you find a particle precisely in a certain point or outside a certain point. It is more or less, to give an elementary example, if one consider the situation of a town in which on Sunday it is prohibited, absolutely prohibited, the circulation of any vehicles, any outdoors. So the statistics say that during a normal Sunday, 25 persons are killed in auto accidents. So after that Sunday, they didn't be killed. But this doesn't allow you, when you go out and you find your neighbor, say, oh, I congratulate you because you were not killed yesterday. would be ridiculous, no? So you know that 25 people are there, and this were not there in the case of a normal Sunday. But you cannot say concerning whatever individual that he had the probability of being killed rather than. So in the case of the Heisenberg relation, something of this kind happens. So they determine certain probabilities, and one must check a frequency, not a single case, a frequency, and see whether the frequency of the phenomenon corresponds within certain margin of errors to the probability calculated.
Thank you. We have one last question from Punyam Pandey. Following from the mention of crisis, would you consider Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigm shift to be supporting realism, anti-realism, or perhaps neither?
Well, you see, one can make use of Kuhn's in different ways. So it is possible to interpret Kuhn's paradigm shift in the sense of a transition through a crisis, but not necessarily. But one must say also that Kuhn himself doesn't consider this issue very seriously, because he compares this with the transition from generation to generation. So it happens that certain difficulties remain difficulties until some new idea appeared. And at the beginning, the new idea can solve very, very, very limited, significant cases. But then the old generations dies. And the new generation becomes accustomed to this new perspective, to this new paradigm. And so you have, it is not really the case of speaking that there is a crisis. In a sense, you can say, I have already said that it depends on how you define the very notion of crisis, because the idea of crisis comes from medicine, from Hippocrates. The crisis in the course of an illness was the period in which the sick man was either out of sickness or died. This was the moment. So in the case of Kuhnian paradigm change, sometimes maybe so, and in other cases it is not the case.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we don't have questions anymore, and if Susan would like to ask a question, then we would take her question, or we would just call it a day, and maybe I'll hand it over to Misha or Susan for the vote of thanks. And thanks.
You asked a lot of good questions. So I don't have anything more to ask or to add, except to thank Professor Agazzi for joining us, and to thank you for doing such a good job of chairing the discussion.
Okay, it was a pleasure for me to be with you, and so I thank you, and I hope that in a not too far future to be able to come and visit the Einstein house and your center. Thank you very much.
That would be lovely. We would welcome you. Good night.
Good night.